Thank you very much for attending this session. This talk titled The Red Square, Mapping the Connections Inside Russia's APT Ecosystem. Let me give you a short introduction about this talk. So, in the last 15 years, many Russian operations and malware families were publicly exposed by different security vendors and intelligence organizations. Now, those publications focused on specific Russian actor or operation, but the bigger picture remains unclear, which is the Russian APT ecosystem as a whole. We wanted to get a better understanding of how this ecosystem looks like in terms of the connections between the different components, and that is why we conducted this research. I'm really happy to be here today and to show you the results. And I'll also present several open source tools that we built during our research and now can be used by you guys, the community, for further investigation. But before we start, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Ari Eitan, and I'm the VP of Research at Intezer. I usually present this talk with Itai Cohen, a security researcher from Checkpoint. Now, this research is a result of a collaboration made by Checkpoint Research Group and Intezer's research team, which was led by Itai here and Omri Ben Basat from our side. And in total, we worked on this research for a few months. So let's start. As I said, we wanted to detect connections between different Russian entities, right, such as a pair of malicious samples, whole families, and even between Russian actors themselves. But what is a connection? A connection can be shared module, tool, or even a specific implementation of a function. Our research was very wide, and we weren't limited to one type of connection. We had many questions in mind that we wanted to answer. For example, are the different Russian government entities working alone, or are they sharing code and techniques with each other? And if so, what artifacts, libraries, and code are more likely to be shared between two different actors or two different tools? Can we support a known connection between two different actors, but from a technical perspective and not from the intelligence perspective? And so on and so forth. We really had many questions in mind. All those questions led us to start reading public information that was shared by other vendors, researchers, and even governments regarding Russian attacks. There is a lot of information available out there, so actually that was the first step we took, and it was a very important one, so I would like to thank all the amazing researchers who published regarding Russian attacks in the past years. Now, after days of reading background materials and publications, it was clear to us how we should proceed towards this goal of mapping the Russian ecosystem. Now, to put it simply, we split the research into 4 steps. The first step is to collect samples that we know were attributed to Russia. Then we need to classify those samples, which may sound easy, but it was a tricky step, and I'll elaborate on that. Next, we want to find the code similarities, the connections between the different samples. And lastly, analyze the interesting and relevant connections. So let's start. As I said, first stage was to collect samples. We extracted IOCs from all the report that we read, and then we had to grab the actual samples, the binaries, from many sources. Overall, we had approximately 2,000 unique samples to work with. Now, the next step was to classify those samples. And although it may sound easy, right, since the name of the attack appears in the report that we grabbed the IOCs from, classifying the samples turned out to be one of the most complicated parts of this research, right? And I'll explain why. First of all, there is no naming convention for malware and threat actor in the infosec industry. Every malware family and every actor have more than one name given to them by different vendors. Some vendors will be used different names to describe the same family, and other malware families simply do not have a clear name. So those issues and more made us face one of the most painful drawbacks of classification and required us to be very careful when we classify a specific piece of malware to a family or an actor. But actually, naming convention was not the only problem, and sometimes we discovered problems with the IOCs. Right? They were too generic or even wrong, and since we needed to know exactly what every sample does, we had to dive in deeper. So we did, and we built this template, 4 pieces of information that we wanted to collect for every sample of Russian malware that we had. First of all, actor. Which actor is known or likely to have written this malware? For example, Turla, Gray Energy, Sophacy, and so on. Next, family. What is the common family name that is associated with this malware? Module. Many malware files are built in a modular way, in which the malware can load a specific module embedded in it or download the module from a C2 server. And we wanted to know whether the sample we have is a keylogger module, a communication module, an injection module, or anything else. And lastly, version. Now, some malware files have a clear version stamp embedded in it. And when possible, we wanted to be able to differentiate between earlier and recent versions. Now, at this point, we classified all our samples into 60 families and 200 different modules. And then we were ready to move on to the third part, which is finding the code similarities. For that, we used Interzer's genetic malware analysis technology, which basically means that for every sample of malware that we collected, we automatically disassembled and dissected each binary into thousands of small pieces of assembly. We refer them as genes. And then we search in which other malware samples, Russian samples, we have seen those genes in the past using this genome database. Now, this database contains genes, which are the assembly fragments, from both malware files, including Russian files, but also from legitimate software, which helps us to focus only on the unique and malicious code that was shared between the different Russian samples, right, without wasting time on shared library code, like OpenSSL, for example. So eventually, we were able to connect different Russian samples based on their pure assembly code. And every connection means that we've seen those genes only between those 2 Russian samples, and not in any other malware which is not Russian, right, or a trusted software. So it's really powerful connecting the samples based on that. But actually, it was a bit more complex than that, because some of the files were packed, the samples were packed, in order probably to stay evasive, so we had to unpack them automatically, statically, or dynamically. And the output of this process was a list with pairs of samples pairs of Russian samples that share code with each other. So the next step was to make this list to a graph. So now we had a decent amount of connection to analyze, and we came upon this open source software called Gaffey, which is, how many of you are familiar with Gaffey? Yeah, okay. So Gaffey is a platform to visualize and analyze graphs. So we downloaded it and loaded our data, and then we got this as a result, which is obviously not practical. There's nothing we can do with it. So we applied some graph layout algorithms to the graph in order to make it usable, as you can see here. And that was the result. We could start spotting some clusters and even connections, which was nice, but we're still missing the context. So we added labels and colors to the graph, and now we were ready to start analyzing the clusters and connections. The colors here represent the different Russian actors. So it's very easy to find the connections in a visual way. Now, there are 3 types of connections on this graph. The first one, which is the most obvious one for us, is when 2 samples are of the same actor and malware family, right? The second type of connection is when 2 samples are of the same actor but of a different family. And the third type of connection, which is obviously is the most interesting one for us, is when two samples share code and belongs to different family and different actor. Those are the type of connections that we're looking for. Now, before I show the results of this analysis we did, let me introduce you with our first open source tool I'll present today. So we took this huge map from Gaffey, and we turned it into a web-based map where you can interact with it and conduct your own analysis. Let's have a quick demo of it. First of all, it's live, aptecosystem.com, so you can try it. But I already prepared it, and this is how it looks like. In this graph, every node is a malware family and not a sample. That's why you see less nodes than the previous graph. But you can zoom in and start spotting the connections. And for this node, for example, I can immediately see the name of it, the actor, the other connections that it has to other samples. And once I click on that, I get this sidebar with some more information regarding this specific malware family. So I can see some synonyms, because remember, there's no standard for naming convention in the industry, a short description of the malware family, some references that we recommend to read, and of course links to the platform where you can conduct your own analysis and see the genetic report of the specific sample and connections. Now, the map and the raw data are both open source, so you can use it, you can conduct your own analysis, and they're all available on our GitHub. So please try it and give us your feedback. And yeah, that's about this map. So now we have this huge map of connections, and we were ready to start analyzing them. And for us, as reverse engineers, it's where the fun part begins. So we analyzed and analyzed many connections, and we really hope to find some groundbreaking findings, some new and undetected connections that nobody ever mentioned before. But unfortunately, I don't need a Wi-Fi anymore. To our disappointment, we couldn't find any cross-actor connection. And we couldn't find that two different actors operating under the same Russian umbrella are sharing code with each other. Make it stop. We did find many indications that two different families operating under the same actor are sharing code, but not between the different actors. Right. So at first, we were quite disappointed by this result, right? Because we really wanted to find some new and undetected connection. But then we realized that the fact that no code was shared between the different Russian actors is an interesting conclusion by itself, right? And then we started to ask ourselves why. Why the different Russian actors are not sharing code with each other. And while we could come up with some theories, the truth is that we really don't know. And of course, we don't have anyone to ask. But we do have some theories. The first theory is that Russia is well aware of the importance of operational security, OPSEC. Now let's have a quick pros and cons of the decision not to share code in terms of OPSEC. So Russia knows that in case of sharing code between two different actors, if one actor would get caught, it would put the other operations at risk, right? And this is obviously something they would like to avoid. And by separating the code base, they can make sure it won't happen. But of course, it comes with a cost, and a very expensive one, because if this theory is true, it means that Russia is willing to invest time, efforts, and man-hours in having different teams of malware developers writing the exact same functionality over and over again, instead of just sharing code between the different tools. Now, the second theory that we have is completely different. And in this theory, Russian organizations do not share code due to internal politics. This could happen, but again, we don't know that for sure. I just wanted to put it on the table as an option. So, unfortunately, we couldn't find any unknown connection, an undocumented connection, but we still analyzed many samples and many connections. And we wanted to do something with it. So we wrote another tool. By having access to thousands of samples, we were able to tell which genes, which are the assembly fragments per sample, which genes are the most popular per family. So we wrote the APT detector, which basically what we did is we grabbed the most popular genes per family, and then we automatically generated Yara rules based on those genes. We merged all the Yara rules from all the different Russian families into one Yara rule set, and we wrapped it with Python and executable, and now it's ready to use. You can use it to scan your systems and to make sure that you're not infected. This tool, by the way, is cross-platform, so you can execute it both on Linux, Mac, or Windows. And once again, both the Yara rules and, of course, the tool itself are all open source and available on our GitHub. So you can take the Yara rules, for example, and deploy them in any other system that you may have, or conduct your own analysis using those rules. So this is the second tool. And that's basically it. Thank you very much. I'll be around if you have any further questions. And I hope you enjoyed.